Okay, everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Chapter 6, The Cultural Geography of the United States. So first, let's start off by talking about the United States. USA! USA! The United States is super diverse. This diversity is a reflection of our historical experience because we've always had a lot of immigrants. Immigration, of course, is the movement of people into one country from another one. We have tons of immigrants. In fact, most Americans are descendants of immigrants. When we're talking about the typical American, most Americans live in the eastern part of the United States. They usually live along rivers, or maybe sometimes they live along the Pacific coast. Over the years, the United States has experienced urbanization, which is the movement of people from rural areas to cities. In fact, most people in the United States, the typical American, actually lives in a metropolitan area. A metropolitan area includes cities with a population of at least 50,000 and its outlying suburbs. Urbanization, though, has a major problem, which is called urban sprawl. Because more and more people keep coming to cities, they keep building and building and building, and these human environments spread outwards from cities and suburbs, which can actually cause problems with ecosystems. Now let's shift gears to history and government. Now, of course, this is going to go by really quick. It's going to take me like 2 minutes maybe. Eventually, you're going to have 3 classes about the history of the United States. So this is just kind of an introduction, something that you've probably already studied and will continue to study in more depth in the future. So before the arrival of Europeans, North America was populated by indigenous groups, people who are native to a particular place. These indigenous groups had advanced cultures, they had traditions, they had religions, they had governments. Their societies were shaped by the climate and the resources that they had access to. So groups in the north were way different than groups in the south, which were way different than groups living in the mountains, who were way different than groups living along the coast. There was a huge variety of people. When Europeans discovered America, they introduced disease, and that actually destroyed the population. It killed huge numbers of people. Some estimates go as high as 90% of the indigenous population of America was killed by disease. This allowed Europeans to come in and be like, oh man, look at all this great land that's just sitting here. There's nobody here. And look, there's practically crops growing out of the ground. Well, that's because just a few years ago, there were huge populations of indigenous people living there. Eventually, Great Britain came to dominate most of the land east of the Mississippi. By the middle of the 1700s, England was pretty much in control. Their 13 colonies eventually fought a war for independence from Great Britain, and this was fought over high taxes, a lack of representation, and limits on freedom. They won the war. It was kind of a miracle because Great Britain was so powerful at the time. And they founded a federal republic as the new government of the United States, which was kind of unheard of at the time. A federal republic, meaning federal, of course, the division between the states and the national government, and a republic, meaning we elect representatives to vote for us in the legislature. During the 1800s, the United States expanded rapidly across the continent. We kept getting bigger and bigger. Unfortunately, this expansion came at the expense of Native Americans whose land was taken and whose societies were exterminated by greedy pioneers. It was also built on the back of African slaves who were forced to work under horrible conditions, and it came at the expense of Mexico, who was forced to surrender 50% of its territory to the United States in the Mexican-American War. Now, this war actually caused a whole bunch of tensions to arise in American society, especially over slavery. These tensions had existed before, but it got even worse as a result of the war. Tensions grew over slavery and the differences in industrialization between the North, which was highly industrialized, and the South, which was more focused on farming. And it led to the Civil War. The North eventually won the Civil War, although it was super bloody, and the scar of that war still remains with us in terms of what people think about the war, and also racism, especially towards different minority groups. During the late 1800s and the 1900s, advances in technology, cheap immigrant labor, and plentiful natural resources allowed unparalleled economic growth. The United States won or participated in and eventually was on the winning side in 2 world wars, which helped us become a global superpower. But throughout that time, there was all sorts of social change. Minority groups began receiving rights. African Americans and women suddenly had the ability to participate more in society and weren't discriminated against as much, although that discrimination still exists. Also, immigration changed. Instead of everyone coming from Europe, a lot more immigrants were coming from Latin America and Asia. Today we face some challenges still. Terrorism has been a central concern to national security, especially since September 11th in 2001 when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center. Since then, the United States has been embroiled in controversial conflicts in the Middle East. So there's a quick summary of American history. You'll get a lot more of that in the future. Now let's shift gears to American culture. Of course, the main language spoken in the United States is English. There are lots of dialects of it, but it's all grouped around English. But since there are so many immigrants in our country and so many immigrant communities, there are lots of other languages that are spoken. Most people in the United States are Christian, but basically any religion present in the world is also present in the United States because immigrants have brought those religions here. Here we also have advanced education systems and healthcare. Now, both of these are kind of controversial because sometimes poor and minority groups struggle to receive adequate services in these 2 sectors. And of course, the arts and innovation have all been heavily shaped by American culture, especially recently. For example, jazz spreading across the world, and more recently maybe hip-hop and rock and roll have spread across, bringing different cultures. And even sports. Sports that originated here are now being played all over the world, like baseball and basketball. Okay, now let's talk about our neighbors to the north, Canada. Oh, Canada, that's all that I know. Anyway, so in Canada, most people are descendants of immigrants, just like in the United States. But generally, those immigrants originally are descendants of people from Great Britain, from France, and then indigenous groups like the Inuit who live in the north. There's also been a lot of immigration from all over the world. It is an immigrant society, just like the United States. 90% of the people in Canada live within 100 miles of the United States border. And most people in Canada live in urban areas, like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Edmonton. Canada and the United States are kind of partners in the world and in world history, and as a result, their history shares a lot in common with the United States. Just like the United States, indigenous groups lived throughout Canada until Europeans introduced disease and lots of different conflicts, which wiped out huge numbers of the population. French settlers and trappers came in who were interested in finding beaver pelts, which were really valuable in Europe at the time. And they claimed control of Canada. Eventually, they lost this control to Great Britain. When the United States became independent, suddenly Great Britain and the Canadians especially began fearing that America was going to invade Canada, which encouraged these different groups of French and English people to work together. They developed a government which eventually became semi-independent from Great Britain. Canada became what was called a dominion. It's a partially self-governed country but it had really close ties to Great Britain. Eventually, Canada would gain its independence in 1931, but Britain actually still had final say over changes to the Constitution. So it wasn't until 1982 that Canada became truly independent, because then the British weren't allowed anymore to change their constitution. Today, Canada is a constitutional monarchy. Their government is a constitutional monarchy. They have a parliament, which is their national legislature, or the people who make laws, and this includes a Senate and the House of Commons. So continuing with their history, despite being afraid of American invasion, they, during the 1800s, continued to grow in population. There was a huge influx in immigration from the East and the West, actually. But this immigration caused a strain with French-speaking minority groups in Quebec. The minority population who speaks French is called the Quebecois. Nevertheless, westward expansion continued. Canada moved across the continent in much the same way as the United States, although less violently. This westward expansion was fueled by natural resources like gold. There was tons of fertile soil for farming, and there was lots of timber. But again, just like in the United States, this came at the expense of indigenous populations who were pushed off their land. It wasn't as violent, like I said, but it still hurt them. Today, the United States and Canada maintain super close ties. Some say that the relationship between the United States and Canada is the closest relationship of any two countries ever to have been on Earth. We have close ties and relations because of different pacts, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eliminated tariffs and other trade barriers between different countries in North America. So that's a quick rundown of Canadian history. Now let's look at their culture. They have two official languages, English and French. Most Canadians are Christian, but again, just like the United States, there are many immigrants, and those immigrants brought many religions. They also brought many languages. Canada has one of the most advanced education systems and also nationalized healthcare. This is provided for all of their citizens. Canada has also affected the arts, literature, just like the United States. Some of the greatest movie stars around are actually from Canada. So that's a quick rundown of Chapter 7. It's kind of like an introduction to the United States and to Canada. A lot of it's probably review, so hopefully you were able to find some new information there or some new ways of thinking about it. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you learned something. Have a great day.